I'd like to talk about the Seiko 3923. And here in front you have two versions of it, a not very good condition blue and a very good condition green. Now, these are an example of early high-end Seiko quartz watches. They were released in around 73, 74. And I don't want to go into too much detail on early Seiko quartz history because I want to do a separate video because it's a really interesting subject in and of itself. But for the purposes of this video, let's just say in '69, Seiko released their first quartz, the Astron, which was accurate to about 5 seconds a month. And once they entered the 70s, their Daney and Suwa factories were competing, and this was a Daney release in around 73, and this was called the 93 SQ movement. It was accurate to about 10 seconds a month, which may not be that impressive now, but you have to factor in that in the early 70s, it was a very significant achievement. And these were very much high-end watches. Let me pull up the catalog from 74 that I found on the Watch Hunter website. And here you can see there were the blue gradient version, green gradient version, and a brown gradient version. There was a day version, a date version, and there also was another series using the same movement that had a slightly different case and a slightly different crystal and a slightly different dial. Those aren't as interesting in my opinion, and they're obviously a gold-plated thing, but I'm done with gold plating. And most importantly, take a look at the price. That's right. That was a very expensive watch back then, especially if you factor in that in the late 60s, the starting salary for a Japanese government employee was about 25,000 yen per month. And that really puts it into perspective. These two watches, retail combined, would probably be roughly half of a basic Honda or Toyota in '74. So these were, again, extremely expensive watches. And when you handle them, it really becomes apparent. Now, the funny thing is, the main reason I picked it up initially, and I initially picked up the blue one, about a year ago, and then found a better condition green one. This blue one isn't in great condition. It was cheap, but the main reason I got it was, sorry, a moment, was because I was interested in the rectangular case, and I had taken interest in JLC reversos, and I wanted to try a rectangular case, even though this is larger than a standard reverso. And once I got it, I mean, first of all, I was fine with the way the rectangular case wore, but I became so interested in the history and the aesthetics and the design and the details of this that I forgot about the reverso. Now, again, apologies for the poor condition on this one. As you can see, the faceted crystal has scratches, and unfortunately, the dial has some deterioration. Let me just clean the green one because they are sort of dust magnets. And here we have, again, sorry for some dust here. There's one little scratch, but the dial is absolutely clean, and aside from the scratch in the center, as is the crystal. And in both cases, you see there's a gradient. On the top, it's almost black, and as you go down, it gets lighter and lighter and lighter. It's an amazing feature that you rarely, if ever, see on a watch. And if you get it at the right angle, there we go. It almost looks like it's fresh paint. And the dial hardware is also very high quality. The hands are really, really nice. They're not loomed, but they're really, really, really just, they fit the aesthetic well. Now, the quartz is a bit weird, the marking on the quartz. Again, in modern times, you might roll your eyes and think, who cares? But again, this was bleeding edge technology for the time. And the quartz marking is actually on the faceted crystal. It's not on the dial itself. Later, I'll pull up a picture showing you what the dial looks like without the crystal, so you get an idea. The other thing you have is the light at 1 o'clock. Now, my understanding is that is an indicator for, God, sorry, debris keeps getting on the crystal. It's supposed to be an indicator of power that it's working. Like in modern watches, they have like an end-of-life indicator showing when you have like the second hand jumping seconds or something like that. So when you first put in a new battery, like I did here, the light blinks pretty strongly. Let me turn the light off here to give you an example of what that looks like. That's pretty bright. Whereas this one has a battery I put a new battery in it over a year ago, and you can't see anything even in the dark. So if you're bothered by the bright light, it lasts for, I want to say, maybe a month or so, and then it mostly subsides. But the weird thing is, even when the light subsides, the watch keeps working, and it's been working on the same batteries for over a year now. So it's not really a very good indicator of power, because even after it fades, the watch still works. In my experience, they've been accurate. Well, okay, this is relatively new to me, but this one's accurate to maybe 2 seconds a month, maybe 1 second a month. Amazingly accurate, even though technically its accuracy is 10 seconds a month. Supposedly, the quartz crystal in these was specially made to work optimally at the normal temperature of the human body on your skin. So it's supposedly more accurate when you're wearing it on your wrist than off. Again, the details are just amazing. I mean, if you look at the faceted crystal, look how much detail it has on it. And I know a lot of brands, especially Seiko, really went crazy with facets in the 70s. And oftentimes they're a bit overwhelming, but I think the facet in this case just works really, really well, and it just frames the watch well. Even the quartz thing, it just works well. And has a nice Seiko applied logo, which sometimes you find they get droopy. I've seen more than one, and this is their VFA series, or very fine adjustment. Interestingly enough, in the same year, a Grand Seiko VFA was only slightly more expensive than this. These were one of the most expensive watches in their entire catalog at the time. So again, for some people it's a bit hard to really appreciate what that meant. And again, I'd like to talk about that in more detail in a separate video, but just appreciate the fact this was super high end, and this was really, really modern technology for the time. If you look at it from the side profile, you may wonder, how on earth do you open it? And I'm going to pull up some pictures to show you how I did it. Once you remove the straps, and it was really cleverly hidden, you see on the right the 2 springs. There's a spring on each side at 12 o'clock and at 6 o'clock. What you do is you have to push each spring in, and that will allow you to pull the top case off. And that leaves you with the sandwich of the crystal, a gasket, and it's leaning on the outer case, and the movement and dial is sitting in the middle. So you pull off the crystal and the gasket, and there you have the dial. And you can see the quartz isn't there. It's so, the proportions are so odd, but the faceted crystal, I think, really ties everything in together. And again, if you look at the deep paint, the quality paint on that dial, it's just amazing. When you think this watch is from '74, I don't think I've ever seen anything that is such high quality. Which, again, given the price, isn't surprising. So once you're at that point, at 2 o'clock there's a hole, and you use a tool to press down, and that allows you to remove the crown stem, the stem and crown, and then you're left with the challenge of how do you replace the battery. Well, I found you put the crystal back on top of the dial, then you flip the whole thing over, and then you remove the back case as you have here, and that's how you can go to work on removing the batteries. It takes 2 batteries, and they're in those little insulated cups. I was really heartbroken when I replaced the batteries and I flipped it over, it didn't start working. As it turns out, you have to reinsert the stem for it to start working, and everything was fine. I know that with modern batteries it works at least for 1 year, and as I said, I think the light really blinks substantially for maybe a month or 2, give or take, something like that. It's a bit odd, but eventually you get used to it. It's sort of funny, since it has no lume at night, the only thing on the watch you see is the blinking light. But again, it was just, at the time, Seiko, like any other watch company, they were just experimenting and doing all sorts of things with these new quartz designs. And especially with the more expensive watches, I guess you really needed a gimmick. And yeah, you could say the aesthetics are sort of 70-ish. But I think the quality of the gradient and just the quality of the dial, I think it works just as well today as it would in the 70s, which is not something you can say for a lot of watches from the 70s. And it's such a shame that there's deterioration on this, but again, I wanted a cheap one when I first got this, and I really wouldn't mind getting another blue one. I'm not so sure about the brown. They also came with bracelets sometimes, but I don't know. I seem to be happy with this vintage rubber on them. Incidentally, it's 19mm lugs on these. And anyway, when you're finished everything, you reassemble and you snap back the outer case and you make them go over the springs, and that's how it is. As far as spare parts, not easy to find. I imagine the best thing is probably to buy junker watches, because like the gasket you have between the crystal and the rear case, I mean, I don't think that's something you can just get off the shelf. And same thing with most of the other parts. And obviously, if I put the battery in and it never worked, I'd have to try to find someone who would fix something as obscure as this. So keep in mind, if you're going to pursue early quartz, servicing is an issue, because even if you have someone who can work with them, parts are really difficult to find. But the prices on them are surprisingly soft, and I really am amazed at how expensive they were and how cheap they are now. And they're really just jewels. They're just not little, but big jewels, and they're just so detailed, and they're really just fun to wear. And to be honest, of all the watches I have, I think this model is probably my favorite. I don't feel so comfortable wearing it in inclement weather because I'm not sure just how well the gasket sealing is. But, and you know, in that respect, I probably prefer wearing the blue. I probably prefer the blue gradient overall, and I guess I'm less worried about damaging things with this one than that one. I never thought I'd be the kind of person who would say that, but I guess that finally happened to me. They're just jewels. They're just have so much beautiful detail on them, and they're really, really enjoyable to wear. And this is really an example of important early history for quartz watches for Seiko. And again, I'd like to do a separate video going into more detail about early Seiko quartz and the significance of how everything ties in, so I don't want to drag this video down even more time-wise. So I guess I'll just leave it at that, and I'll give you some more Temset close-ups on the gradient. Now, there we go. You see that shininess near the Seiko? I mean, it looks like that paint was just applied. And it's just absolutely amazing detail. And even on the dial that has some deterioration, you can still see how shiny it is, and it's just such high quality. And I have no idea how they created these dials, but it really, even in the beat up one, it's just, the detail is really amazing, at least for me. And there's just, in general, there's not a lot of information available on these watches. So as usual, in situations like that, I think it's worthwhile to create some documentation that would be helpful for others. And that's about it for this video. And as usual, thanks for watching.